Embracing uncertainty sounds nice, and it is. If you take the right decisions, if you're successful, that's great. But we also know that if we take the wrong decisions, we may end up in failure, and that may cost money, and it may affect our careers. So, is there a way that we can make sure that we spot that we are on the wrong track early? Is there a way how we can deal with it? Well, there are organizations out there who deal with high consequence decisions on a regular basis. They're called high reliability organizations. They are the ones who are having to make sure that they are not risking people's lives, because when they fail, it does not only cost money, but people may actually die. So what are these organizations doing to deal with uncertainty? Let's have a look. One of the examples of a high reliability organization is the airshow team of the Swiss Air Force, the Patrol Suisse. And as you can see, they perform high-performance maneuvers in high speed, close formation, and very difficult maneuvers. So how are they going to do that and still deal with uncertainty? Well, one thing is they're very select in the people who they let into their team. That's one thing. They have to demonstrate competency, and they have to undergo a very tough selection process. But that's not all. We have to see them in their action. And there's a nice example at an event that was taking place to commemorate the death of Oscar Bieder. And they know they had to perform along their motto, and that is safety, precision, and perfection. A very Swiss motto. And they were demonstrating their capability at that event for commemorating Oscar Bieder. When they were planning the event, and when the question came up, are you willing to perform an air show over the town of Langenbruck, that's the birthplace of Oscar Bieder, they were very careful in making sure that it's doable, so that there are no obstructions, wind power turbines, power lines, mountains, whatever. And they figured out it's doable. So they reduced uncertainty as much as possible. But when the day of the air show came, the weather was not cooperating over the place. There were low clouds, the visibility was not good. So they again had to make a decision. Can we do the performance under these conditions? And what turned out was, well, it's legal, it seems doable, so let's go for it. And off they went and they performed their maneuver spectacularly. It would look great on the ground, people were excited, and so on. There was only one problem. They performed the performance at the wrong location. They did not overfly the village of Langenbruck, but they ended up over the town of Mümliswil. There was a yodel festival, everybody was excited, but it was the wrong location. So perfection was not visible here. And maybe that's one of the first indications that even high reliability organizations may not have the magic bullet. But there was a little bit more to that, and we have to look a little bit deeper in how high reliability organizations operate. And the thing here is, when the thing was picked up in the press, and it was not only picked up in the local Swiss press, but it was also picked up internationally, the question came up, well, who is at fault? Who led them to the wrong location? And it became clear the question was the leader. I mean, he was leading the formation to that location. So were they careful enough in getting the right leader? So let's have a look at how leaders are selected in high reliability organization. We look for people who are competent, who have the right personal qualifications when we let them in these high demanding positions. And we make sure that they are trained to perfection. But is that enough? Well, even the most qualified leader may end up in a situation that is a disaster. And this captain I just showed you was not only a regular flight captain, but he was also a training captain, and he was head of flight safety. So he should be knowing what he was doing. And still, he was responsible for one of the worst airline accidents in aviation history. 600 people died. Now the point is, he's a human, and he operated under complex time-pressure condition. And humans are not perfect in these conditions. So yes, we have to take into account that even the best qualified leader may make a mistake and take a wrong turn. However, he, like most others, are not alone. We are surrounded by people who are also competent. And he was with a team consisting of a co-pilot and a flight engineer. And by looking at the transcript from that accident, we knew that that these other two crew members observed that something was going wrong, but they didn't spoke up. Now that brings us to a big challenge that we face time and time again in organizations, that is that people don't voice their concerns. And the question is, what can we do to make people speak up? And they're not only not speaking up because they are anxious about their superiors or other people around them, but it could also be a competency issue, that they don't feel competent enough to voice their concern. Well, we can encourage people to speak up by using a concept that was developed by Amy Edmondson. In her research, she showed that when people operate in an environment where they do not fear that they will be punished or humiliated for bringing up an idea, for speaking up, for voicing a concern, or admitting a mistake, then they're willing to speak up. And she called that condition psychological safety. So if we have psychological safety, we can be relatively sure that people do speak up. Now, what does that mean for our normal business environment? It seemed like too good to be true, because if we have that concept, everything is fine. And by the way, people would like it. No consequences, something going wrong. But sometimes stuff will go wrong and will cost money. So shouldn't we do something here? Well, the point is we should remember that only when people have a safety to speak up, they will do it. If they don't have it, they will keep quiet. And that may prevent them from intervening in a critical action, or it may prevent us from learning if we don't know of such an event. Well, coming back to our group of the Swiss pilots, did they have psychological safety in place? Yes, they did. Like all aviation organizations these days, they had a non-punitive error culture. And the point was not, what should we do with the leader of the team, but what is the learning? And how do they do the learning? Well, they reflect. They sit together and discuss what was happening at that day. Why did we take the wrong decision? And maybe not only the leader, but also the other pilots who were also part of the decision-making process. What led them into that ending up over the wrong location? And by doing that learning exercise, then you have a chance to get better and better. Now, that's not all, because sometimes we are also faced with time-critical conditions where we have to take action early because the conditions are so severe and we have to act quickly. And the question is, how are we going to take decisions in these situations? Now, management theory is very clear with these things. And the standard theory is when you have situations with time pressure, crisis situations, use directive leadership. And this is what was what we often see in organizations. And even in the case of the Hudson River landing with Captain Sullenberger, there was that famous quote, "I have control." Very reassuring if you think about that. But is that really the case? Well, I'd like to take you on another case example. And this time it's a flight. It's a flight from Oslo to Tromsø. We're flying in the middle of the night, and we have to think or to look at one particular instrument that is very important here. It's called the artificial horizon or attitude indicator, and it's in the center of every cockpit. You may not know that instrument by now, but it's very simple. It's like the pilot would look out of the window, and he would see the sky above him, the earth below him. And if the plane starts to climb, you would see more and more blue, like you look up, or if you would descend, you see more and more brown if you look down. And this is the instrument the pilots were looking up in flight. Not all the time, but it was at the center of their location. Now, a little after midnight, in also the middle of the flight, suddenly something strange happened, because the plane was entering a climb, 15 degrees nose up. Not something you'd like to see in cruise condition, especially if it's not ordered. And then the autopilot disconnects. What is the pilot doing? The captain immediately pushed forward the control column to regain control of the aircraft. Did it help? Unfortunately not, because the climb continued. It went up 50 degrees now and started a slight left turn. So the captain pushed even harder, asked the co-pilot, "Come on, help me," and started to turn right. Any effect? No, unfortunately not. Now the plane is almost vertically and turning to the right. What is the co-pilot doing? Well, the co-pilot reacts to the captain, but in a little strange way, because he says, "Come up," when the captain is already almost 50 degrees up. And then he said, turn right. Actually, the plane is already turning right. So why is he doing that? Well, if we have a closer look, it is clear that the co-pilot had a very different instrument indication from the captain. And the point here was the co-pilot was first seeing level flight, no climb, then descent, 10 degrees nose down, and then finally 40 degrees nose down, left turn. And obviously he says come up and then make a right turn correcting. Now the point here is one of these instruments is wrong, and it's the captain's instrument. That is the complication here. So the captain is immediately reacting to a crisis that is obvious to him. He's giving commands, but actually he's acting on a wrong indication. And he's never talking about that. The co-pilot does not understand that the captain has a wrong indication. So that points us to a little kind of complication. Yes, we may have directive leadership, and the leader may be qualified to act, but maybe he has not the complete picture. So how can he get the picture? Well, my colleagues, Jigalai, Mary Waller, Seth Kaplan, and I, we were working on a project where we observed flight crews in emergency situations around the same time this accident happened. And what we observed was there were performance differences of flight crews. Flight crews that had a higher performance showed a particular communication pattern. They had more frequent communication, they had shorter interaction patterns, and they had simpler communication patterns. But there was a fourth factor that was unexpected for us, because these things were actually something that we already hypothesized about. But the fourth thing was we observed that the high-performing flight crews had captains who asked questions. Now that's a little bit surprising, because when you have an emergency situation, it's by definition a high-pressure situation where it's time critical to take action. So why on earth ask questions? Well, we couldn't answer that part from that part of research, but we did another project. So Jigalai, Afner Shachal, and myself went on to interview military pilots and asked them for their perspective of what is it that is important in emergency situations. We didn't prime them. We didn't ask them specifically for questions. When we got the answers, we were a little bit disappointed, because our hypothesis was obviously not resonating with the pilots that we interviewed, because the pilots answered commands are important. And by the way, they also said checklists and standard operating procedures are important. This I would leave aside, because that's very aviation specific. But questions were really not the focus. So was our hypothesis wrong? Well, we had two groups of pilots. These were pilots from the German Air Force. But we have another interview setting, and this was with the Israeli Air Force. And here we got a very different picture. The pilots of the Israeli Air Force, they said almost uniformly, questions are important in emergencies. Commands are not really that much important. We need questions. Now, what's the difference here? Well, we have the operational environments for these two Air Force groups are very different. The German Air Force operates mostly in peacetime condition, whereas the Israeli Air Force operates in a conflict-rich environment. Almost all the missions are like combat missions, and you have a lot of interference, more emergencies than the Germans would encounter. So why were the Israeli pilots advocating for asking questions? Well, we had the interviews, so we had answers. Let's have first a look at the German ones. And here the commander said, well, in an emergency situation, I have to take control, because I'm the most experienced person. And by the way, I have ultimate responsibility. But there's more. My co-pilots are trained in psychological safety. They know they should speak up when I do a wrong decision, so I can rely on them. For me, it's just paving the way, and if I'm on the wrong track, they will interact with me and correct me. However, when we ask the co-pilots, we get a slightly different perspective. And it was regardless whether we were talking to the Israeli co-pilots or the German co-pilots, because all of them said, well, if the captain is giving a direction, I follow that direction. Why should I intervene? Only if I see a severe problem, then I would intervene. Otherwise, I keep my mouth shut. So they wouldn't bring in their perspective. For the Israeli captains, for the commanders, we got a quite different perspective, because they were way more reflective than the German ones. And they said, I know if I start giving a command and ordering a certain direction, I know my co-pilot won't contradict me. If I'm on the wrong track, it's very hard for the co-pilot to interact with me. So therefore, I'm rather asking them before actually giving my perspective. So here we have these two settings. One group of pilots being exposed regularly to emergencies and being reflected and knowing they should ask, even in time pressure conditions, and the other one not really having these conditions and expecting the people intervening. So what does it all mean for us when we are faced with uncertainty in business? Well, we cannot get certainty by just continuing analyzing. We have to accept that sometimes we may make the wrong decision. But it will always be helpful if we have people in the team to speak up. And how can we make people speak up? We have to provide them as a safety. That's the one thing. But we should also keep in mind that sometimes it's hard for them to speak up. So next time, when you are faced with an uncertain condition, when you have to take action, remember there are people around you that can provide input and perspectives, but you have to do one thing, and that is to ask questions. Thank you.